Hello everyone, we're into our second week of biogeochemistry. This week we're going to be talking about the water cycle, we're going to talk about the energy balance, and we're going to be talking about the carbon cycle. Now the nice thing about the water cycle is that it's actually something that most of you have probably already learned about and already thought about. It's much more accessible to people. We can watch rain happening, we can see water running through the rivers, we can observe evapotranspiration. So it's much easier to engage with than the nitrogen cycle or the phosphorus cycle. Essentially, the water cycle can be divided into three components: water entering the atmosphere, water returning to the Earth's surface through precipitation, and the fate of water on the ground. So at this point in my lectures on nitrogen and phosphorus, I gave you a little bit of a slide explaining why nitrogen and phosphorus were so important for biological activity. So here we're going to think about what the relevance is of the water cycle for biology. You'll find out in this lecture that water drives most biological processes because it has links with carbon capture and plant productivity. You will also discover how climate, plants, and soils can modify the water cycle. And that's one of the most interesting things about the water cycle, is the degree to which the relative fluxes in the water cycle can be modified by biological processes. We learned about mass balance in the first lecture on biogeochemistry, and this concept will be important when you think about the water cycle. Essentially, when it comes to understanding the water cycle, you need to know that the inputs equal the outputs. The cycle is in balance. So in this equation, precipitation equals evapotranspiration plus drainage plus runoff plus storage. Now 4 of the terms in this equation are fluxes and 1 is a stock. Can you have a think about which one of these would be a stock? Storage is a stock. So basically storage will increase, the amount of storage, the amount of water stored in the soil will increase if precipitation is greater than evapotranspiration, drainage, and runoff. Then the storage will increase. On the other hand, if evapotranspiration, drainage, and runoff are greater than precipitation, then storage will decrease. So you can actually measure the size of the stock, the amount of water in the soil, and know which of these fluxes are greater than the other fluxes, and that's because of mass balance. Essentially, the ecosystem behaves like a bucket that is filled by precipitation and emptied by evapotranspiration and runoff and drainage. How full the bucket is will tell you the hydrological state of the system. If it is water stressed, it is water stressed when the outputs are high and the inputs are low. So here's a little diagram to represent that equation that I just showed you. We've broken some of the terms up into smaller terms, and I'm going to talk to you about each of these fluxes for the rest of the slides and what controls each of these fluxes. Let's start with thinking about precipitation, which is pretty much the only input of water to the ecosystem. There are lots of ways that water can leave, but precipitation is the way that it comes in. So precipitation is pretty much the only way that water can get into ecosystems. A little bit gets in from overland flow from other landscapes, but mostly it's precipitation. One very common form of precipitation is rainfall, which is the dominant form in the tropics. You can get convective rainfall. That happens when layers of warm, moist air rise into cooler regions of the atmosphere, causing thunderstorms in the summertime, like in the afternoons in Johannesburg. You get orographic rainfall, and that's rain that's produced from the lifting of moist air over a mountain. When air hits a mountain, then it has to rise, and when it rises, it cools, and that causes precipitation. So that's why mountains are often quite wet places. You get montane forests because forests can grow on mountains due to orographic rainfall. Finally, you get synoptic rainfall, and those are weather systems associated with big frontal systems moving across a landscape. An example are the Cape Town winter storms. That's a big low-pressure system coming from Antarctica and sweeping across Cape Town, bringing synoptic rainfall. You also get occult precipitation, mist or fog. And this is actually quite an important component of precipitation in many ecosystems. Or the west coast of South Africa, many of the ecosystems there depend largely on mist as a form of precipitation. And organisms who live in these places have clever ways of capturing that mist. You can see a picture of the Namib dune beetle that has found ways to capture the mist and provide water for itself. Finally, dew is also a form of precipitation. The rains have stopped in Johannesburg for a few weeks, but still every morning there's dew on the grass. But dew is never a very large proportion of the precipitation. Finally, hail and snow are solid forms of precipitation. Snow is generally pretty unimportant in the tropics, but it can be the main form that water gets into a system when you're in the temperate regions. Now let's focus on the outputs that go back up to the atmosphere. There are actually 3 different fluxes out, but together they are called evapotranspiration, or ET. When liquid turns back into a gaseous phase, it is lost to the system by evapotranspiration. But it makes a difference where that water came from. If the water came from the soil or the land surface, it is called evaporation. If the water came from inside a plant, it is called transpiration. And if the water was evaporated from the surface of a plant leaf, it is called interception. It takes energy to turn a liquid into a gas, so when evapotranspiration happens, it takes up heat and it cools the surface. This is why we sweat when we are hot, so we can cool down when our sweat evaporates. This is also why we sit under a tree to keep cool. Not only does it provide shade, but it also cools the air around it when it loses water through transpiration. I will explain in the next few slides what controls evapotranspiration, as well as how important the 3 different forms of ET are in different circumstances. You can think of evapotranspiration as a demand-supply problem. The ecosystem is supplying water to the atmosphere. The rate at which it supplies this water, the evapotranspiration flux, depends on how strongly the atmosphere pulls the water, as well as how strongly the ecosystem holds onto its water. So if there's a big supply and a high demand, then you'd expect high evapotranspiration. And you get this in the tropical forests at the equator, where there's a lot of water and it's also very hot, so that water gets evaporated. If there's a big supply and a low demand, you get low evapotranspiration. An example of this would be wet, foggy, cold places like Britain or Ireland, where there's a lot of water, there's a big supply, but it's so seldom hot and sunny that hardly any of that water evaporates. If there's a low supply and a high demand, then you get low evapotranspiration. And this is an example of this would be dry places like deserts. The atmosphere is very hot and dry, but there's hardly any water in the soil, so there's not a lot of evapotranspiration. And if there's a low supply and a low demand, you get very low evapotranspiration. An example of this are the boreal forests in Scandinavia. Sometimes they can have less than 300 millimeters of rain a year, but because it's also very cold and not a lot of sunlight, you get very, very little evapotranspiration. An easy way to understand the drivers of evapotranspiration is to think what happens when you hang washing on a washing line. The demand side of the equation is controlled by radiation demand and wind and humidity demand. If it's warm and sunny, your washing dries more quickly. And if the air is already dry, and that dry air keeps moving, your washing dries more quickly. So all this makes a lot of sense, and you might be wondering why I'm explaining it to you in such careful detail. I mean, we all know that if we want our fingernails to dry more quickly, we wave them around, we increase the wind demand. However, once we understand the concepts, we will use this to understand some physics and maths around water movement through ecosystems. So I'm just trying to get the concepts straight in everyone's heads. The supply side of the equation depends on how much water is available. Going back to our washing line, even in the same atmospheric conditions, a thin cotton t-shirt dries more quickly than a pair of woolly socks. This represents the supply side of the equation. We call this surface resistance. How resistant is something to letting its water be evaporated? Now let's try to use this understanding in relation to the natural world. Have a look at this picture. In this picture you've got an open dam, you've got some bare soil, and you've got vegetation. Now essentially these three different land surfaces supply water to the atmosphere at different rates because they have different surface resistances. They all hold onto their water at different rates. If you pour water onto a surface, the puddle of water dries relatively quickly due to its low resistance. Water is readily supplied to the atmosphere. But what if that water is in the soil? In the soil particles hold onto water, that we call the word adhesion. The word adhesion defines how the soil particles hold onto water, so it's harder to evaporate. The surface resistance of a soil depends on both the soil texture and the salinity. Moreover, it gets harder and harder to evaporate the water from the deeper levels in the soil. Depending on the soil, there's usually a soil depth where no more evaporation can occur. So the water in the soil is safe from evaporation if it can infiltrate down to deep levels of the soil, because then there's no longer possible for the sun to evaporate that water. We call this the evaporation zone. Now I've mentioned that the surface resistance of soils depends on the soil texture and the salinity, and you should already know this from other lectures. So I'm going to leave you to answer this question. If you can't, then go back to your soil science notes to find the answer. Now we have to think about transpiration. Plants have much more capacity to control their surface resistance than water and soil does. On a hot day, plants can close their stomates and prevent water loss, so they can have a higher surface resistance than the soil. On the other hand, plant roots can go very deep into the soil, and they can transpire water that would never be evaporated because it's too deep. It's below the evaporation zone, but the plant roots can still access it and send it back up to the atmosphere. The hydraulic system of plants can be seen as a pipe or a straw that is open at both ends. Let's just refresh your knowledge about how plants use water. Water absorbed by the roots enters the plant and enters the xylem, which is the conduit in the interior of the root that carries the soil water to the leaves. So water travels from the roots to the xylem, which transports water to the leaves. Then plants need to control the rate at which water moves through the plant, and this is done through stomata. The stomata are the primary control mechanisms that plants use to reduce water loss, and they're able to do so very quickly. Stomata are sensitive to the environmental cues that trigger the stomata to open or close. The major role of stomata is to allow carbon dioxide to enter to drive photosynthesis, and at the same time to allow the exit of water when it evaporates, which cools the leaf. You've probably learnt in first year about the two specialized guard cells that are on each side, make up each stomata. Plants have many stomata, and they're usually on the lower surface to minimize water loss. Now I need to introduce you to an important term, stomatal conductance. Stomatal conductance is a flux. It's a rate. Remember, fluxes are all rates. And stomatal conductance is the rate at which water is moving through the xylem. Stomatal conductance, the rate at which the water is moving through the pipe, is the inverse of stomatal resistance. Stomatal resistance is how much the plant is holding on to the water and preventing it from being evaporated to the atmosphere, the supply side of the equation. So this is probably something you know already, but it's important to emphasize it here. The reason you get more growth and more productivity in wet places is because plants can only photosynthesize when their stomates are open. And they can only keep their stomates open when there's enough water in the soil. So water availability controls plant growth. All of the previous slides you'd probably already learned in high school and in first year. Now I'm going to talk you through some physics that can help to explain a plant's ecophysiological response to water stress. For that, I need to define something called water potential. The water potential is the potential energy of water in a system compared to pure water. You measured this and quantified it and did a graph of it in your prac, but now we're going to just try understand it a little more in the context of plant water use. Water potential is denoted by the Greek letter psi, and it's expressed in units of negative pressure, so negative megapascals. Essentially, what you're measuring when you're measuring water potential is how much pressure you need to exert on a volume of soil to extract water from it. So you can imagine if you squeezed the soil, how hard would you have to squeeze the soil before the water came out? Or the same with the leaf, if you squeezed the leaf of a plant. The most important thing you need to know is that water always moves towards the more negative water potential. Now, plants control water loss by controlling the water potential in different plant parts through adjusting their stomatal control. You can see in this diagram, it tells you the different water potentials in the different parts of the diagram. When the water potential in the root is more negative than the soil, then water will move from the soil into the plant root. When the water potential in the leaves is more negative than in the roots, then the water will move up the plant into the leaves. When the water potential in the atmosphere is more negative than in the leaves, then the water will be lost to the plant through transpiration, unless, of course, the plant closes its stomates. So in this diagram on the slide, you can see some typical values of water potential for different parts of the ecosystem. In this example, the demand from the atmosphere is very high, negative 90 megapascals, but there's also quite a lot of water in the soil. We know this because the soil water potential is only minus 1 megapascal, which means the soil is not holding onto the water very tightly. So there's a lot of water in the soil pore spaces. The water potential in the plant is between these two values, so the water moves from the roots to the leaves and out to the air. Of course, it sometimes happens that the water potential in the soil becomes less than the water potential in the plant, and I've always told you that water moves towards the more negative water potential. So in that case, water flows the other way, from the leaves to the soil, and the plant wilts. In this example, we've got a poor wilted pot plant that hasn't been watered, so the plant has wilted because the soil water potential is lower than the leaf water potential. But some plants are tougher than other plants, and these are the sorts of plants you want to have as a pot plant if you don't remember to water your pot plants, because some plants can keep their leaf water potential low and not wilt even when the soils become very dry. So in this example, this is a big thick leaf of a protea plant. Proteas come from the fynbos, which is a very dry place because in the summertime there's no rainfall. In this example, the leaf water potential is minus 3 megapascals, even though the soil water potential is still minus 2 megapascals. So for the same soil water potential, some plants will wilt and other plants will still remain turgid, that means not wilted, because they can keep their leaves at a lower water potential. Plants that are able to withstand low water potentials are called drought-tolerant plants. So now we understand that the transpiration component of the water balance is one of the most difficult to quantify. I've put a little question mark here next to the plants because you need to know a lot of stuff before you can work out how much those plants are transpiring. You need to know about the evaporative demand, of course, the water potential of the atmosphere, and that's quite easy to do. You just measure the air temperature and the relative humidity and the wind speed. You need to know about the soil supply, of course, the water potential of the soil, and that's also quite easy to measure. You guys did it in your soil prac. But then you also need to know about plant physiology and how the plants are controlling the rate at which water moves from the soil to the atmosphere through their xylem. Before I move on to other components of the water cycle, I just want to summarize what we've learned about evapotranspiration. Firstly, we know evapotranspiration takes up heat and cools the land surface. It's a cooling process. We also know evapotranspiration moves water from the soil to the atmosphere, so it's a flux out to the atmosphere. The rate, this flux, depends on both the supply, which is the surface resistance, and the demand, which is the atmospheric demand. Finally, we've discussed how plants can influence evapotranspiration by accessing deep water that would otherwise be safe from evaporation and by opening or closing their stomates. So we're back to this picture of the water cycle and we're moving to the final components of the water balance: infiltration, drainage, and runoff. As land managers, we really care about the two fluxes out of the system, runoff and drainage. If the water leaves the system as drainage, then it is water in our rivers and it is useful for animals, plants, and people. If the water leaves the system as runoff, then it causes soil erosion and silting up of dams, and it is not useful. The process that determines whether water leaves as runoff or as drainage is called infiltration. So if we were all in the lecture hall right now, this is when I would make you pair and share. I would get you into little groups and get you to think through all of the things that drive infiltration. The reason I would do this is because actually you already know all of this. It should all make a lot of sense to you based on your current knowledge of soil science and physics. So you need to just look through the slide and see if it makes sense to you. Rainfall landing on the soil surface needs to infiltrate into the soil column. And if it can't infiltrate, it's lost to runoff. Vegetation cover helps to increase infiltration because it slows down how hard the raindrop arrives, and it makes it, and the roots of the plants help make it easier for water to enter. Steep slopes reduce water infiltration, of course, because water runs off a steep slope more than it would run off a flat slope. Intense rain like thunderstorms mean less infiltration because the soil pore volume at the surface gets saturated and then what's left can't infiltrate and it has to run off. Organic matter helps water infiltration because it aggregates the soil into clumps and that makes more space for the water to infiltrate between the soil clumps. And of course, you will have learned that in sandy soils you get more infiltration and less runoff because the pore volume is higher. And in clay soils, water can't infiltrate fast enough, so you get more runoff. This is all very conceptual, but if you remember back to our field trip, I had you look at the infiltration potential of the soil and think about what it all means. Do you remember I got you to score the soil in terms of the factors that aid infiltration? So rooted plants, dung, macropores, and the factors that inhibit infiltration, like clay caps, rocks, and bare ground. So for every one of your quadrats, you had a look and you said, is there vegetation? Is there a cover of litter or dung? Is there an algal crust? Are there macropores? All of those things mean it's easy for the water to infiltrate the soil, so you won't get much runoff or erosion. On the other hand, if your soil had a clay cap or gravel or rock, then you'd expect more erosion. So these things listed in the bottom here are listed from in terms of the highest infiltration potential to the lowest infiltration potential. Now we have defined all of the fluxes in the water cycle, and we've also determined the factors that control the size of these fluxes. So you are truly now systems ecologist when it comes to the water cycle. I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about some application of this work to understanding biological systems. So we should now all be able to agree that soil can affect water availability. Now this means that plants in the same climate experiencing the same rainfall and the same temperature and the same relative humidity can actually experience very different water availability depending on the soil that they're growing in. So now I want you to have a little think about which soil type, clay or sand, is a more water-stressed environment for a plant to grow. To think about this, we need to think about all the different fluxes. We need to think about infiltration. We need to think about field capacity. We need to think about a wilting point for plants. It's not actually such an easy question to answer. So let's have a think about an example. Bob has shown you this slide before. This is a photograph of a part of the Kruger National Park, which is on a katina. So at the top, there's a sandy crest, and at the bottom, there's a more clay bottom land. So these two pictures, one was taken at the top and one was taken at the bottom, they experience the same precipitation, but plants on the sandy crest experience a very different moisture regime from plants on the clay bottom land. Now what we note in the Kruger Park is that you get a high tree biomass on the crest and a lower tree biomass on the bottom land. So that should give us a clue about which is a more moisture-stressed environment to grow. In order to understand and to answer this question about whether sandy soils or clay soils are a more moisture-stressed environment, we have to think through all the information that you already have from your soils lectures and from this lecture. but you need to integrate it to focus on just thinking about water availability. So we know that in sandy soils, water enters the soil easily, but it also drains through quickly. There's high infiltration. Sandy soils have a low field capacity and a low wilting point. And we also know that small rainfall events can be used by plants. On the other hand, in clay soils, water doesn't infiltrate easily. There's a lot of pooling and runoff, so there's low infiltration. Once it's in the soil, it's not easy to extract again, so it has a high surface resistance, got a high field capacity, a high wilting point. It's very hard for plants and the hot atmosphere to extract water from clay soils. And small rainfall events are less useful to plants because sometimes that water is not available. So, have we answered our question? We haven't really. We still don't know whether sandy soils have more water and make it easier for plants to take water up than clay soils. Noy Meir, a wonderful ecologist, Israeli ecologist in 1973, developed the inverse texture hypothesis. He thought about this a lot. And he said that actually, whether a clay soil or a sandy soil is the more water-stressed environment depends on how much rainfall is coming in. In low rainfall regions, he said, a clay soil is a more water-stressed environment than a sandy soil because the little water that does come into the system gets held by the clay particles and are not easily available to the plants. On the other hand, in high rainfall regions, a sandy soil would be a more water-stressed environment than a clay soil because the water would all just drain through quickly and the soil wouldn't hold as much water. So actually, the answer to my question says it depends. It depends where the rainfall is, whether clay soils or sandy soils are more water-stressed environment. In many southern African environments, sandy soils are more moist environments, so we expect taller and denser perennial vegetation than on clay soils. This graph explains the inverse texture hypothesis. On the x-axis, you have annual rainfall, and on the y-axis, you have grass above ground net primary productivity, so how much grass can grow. And it shows how the net primary productivity changes with rainfall on two different soil types, a clay soil and a sandy soil. So now it's very easy to see that at high rainfalls, there's more grass production on the clay soil, but at low rainfalls, there's more grass production on the sandy soils. You need to be able to explain why this is based on the information that I've given you in the previous slide. So I've gone into some detail to explain how soil and soil texture can affect water availability. Now we're going to talk and summarize all the ways that vegetation can affect water availability. All the way through this lecture, there have been examples about how plants can control different aspects of the water cycle. Plants control evapotranspiration rates through stomatal control and deep roots. Plants also increase interception. Do you remember that term in the ET equation? Because water on their leaves evaporates before it even touches the soil. If water lands on a leaf, it evaporates before it goes into the soil. There's no ways that it can increase water availability to the system. On the other hand, plants control infiltration rates because vegetation cover reduces runoff and erosion and increases infiltration rates. This is a visual schematic of all the different influences that more vegetation can have on an ecosystem's water balance. So if you increase the amount of vegetation in a system, for example, if you plant more trees, you'll increase interception and transpiration. So you'll have more losses to the ecosystem, from the ecosystem to the atmosphere. On the other hand, you'll probably increase infiltration as well because you're increasing the vegetation cover. And if you increase infiltration, then you increase base flow or drainage and you decrease surface runoff. So you can see that all of the fluxes are affected in different ways. So is it a good thing to have more vegetation in a system? Is it a good thing for the water balance? It really depends on what your goal is in managing the ecosystem. So this is a horrendous slide. I'm certainly not going to read this through to you while I'm sitting here. You guys will fall asleep if I do that. But I put it in because I thought it would help you to have all the key points in one place. So I expect you to read through the slide in your own time and make sure that if you don't understand one of these statements, then you go back to the slide where I discuss it and see whether you can get it to make sense. Right, this has been quite a content-heavy lecture, but by the end of this lecture, there are 6 things that I need you to be able to do. You need to be able to describe the basic water cycle in terrestrial ecosystems, and you need to be able to explain all the terms in the water balance. Then you need to be able to discuss what controls evapotranspiration of different surfaces. So you need to discuss the demand and the supply side of those equations, and how it works for water, soil, and plants. You need to be able to explain how water potential determines plant water use. So you need to be able to talk about it in terms of physics, in terms of water potential in megapascals. Then you need to discuss what controls infiltration and how infiltration impacts the ratio between runoff and drainage. Finally, you need to be able to link all of this information to the soils practicals and lectures. So all the way through this lecture, you should have been thinking through the activities you did in the soils practicals and information you got from Bob in the soils lectures. So this is a little bit of integration. This slide is just to give you some real values that have been measured in a savanna park just north of Pretoria. All of the other systems diagrams I gave you were just conceptual diagrams where the size of the arrows wasn't really realistic. But now you can see how the 600 mils of rain that comes into Nailsflay every year, how it gets partitioned back into interception, transpiration, and evaporation, and how much of it goes into infiltration and how much of it goes into runoff and drainage. So these arrows in and arrows out should totally balance if you add them all up. And you can see that in the Nailsflay, most of the water that comes in goes out again as evapotranspiration. But there are many other ecosystems where most of the water that goes in goes out again as drainage. It really just depends on the ecosystem you're in.